All right. Today's kind of chat is pretty short. It's going to be our last lecture of the term. For context, the last two lectures we have are pre-recorded. That's just because, frankly, most people don't really go to bonus lectures that aren't worth anything. We usually get 10 people come to them. So rather than kind of spend all the time on that, we do other things and you can just watch the pre-records. If you're interested, one of them is on building a front end. It's a really light lecture that kind of gives people a taste of maybe some of the more fundamental technologies involved in, how the front end was made for you guys for the project, if you played around with the front end. It's very basic stuff, but it's kind of get a feel for it. I don't want to pretend it's an advertisement for COMP1531, the front-end course, because that course is always full, and we don't really need more people doing it necessarily. But it's more give people a sense of oh, this interests me or this doesn't. Because if you do a bit of it and you're like, this looks really boring, I want to go play around with MIPS and 1521 stuff again, then you get a bit more. Yeah, definitely not. And then the last lecture, building an MVP, that also is just a bit of a bonus one that comes out of my time in the startup space, just kind of giving some guidance on how you might actually think about software in the context of a small business, because a lot of what we do in 1531 is really geared towards industrial software, as in software at scale, big companies with hundreds, 100,000, 10,000 staff, etc. But today we're pretty much just talking about the final exam. There isn't really a lecture deck for it because it mostly just links to the page, and then that's the lecture. So everything we're going to be talking about today is just this exam page from WebCMS 3. And this exam page kind of does a pretty good summary of just listing everything that matters for the final exam. I think there's a very small contingent of students who did COMP1531 with me, a very small number last term. And if you're one of those students, this is going to be extremely repetitive. So apologies in advance for that. But basically, when it comes to your final exam, probably the most important thing is just remembering that you really need to kind of be well to sit the exam. UNSW has their rules around if you turn up to sit the exam or to start the exam, then you are kind of deeming yourself as able to do it. You are healthy enough to do it. What this means is if you wake up on, what day is the exam? Monday. Monday in 2 weeks. That's really soon, isn't it? If you wake up on Monday in 2 weeks and you have a really bad migraine, it's time to just not sit the exam. The point is, if you start the exam and then you go and you say, I had a migraine yesterday and it didn't go away, UNSW will say to you, well, you knew that, so you shouldn't have done the exam. It's kind of like the whole pre-existing condition thing. Basically, you can't get special consideration during exam for something that you knew was a problem before the exam. There's an obvious exception to that for health issues during the exam, right? Many people in the course will be battling fairly, natural or obscure health issues all the time, things that kind of come up out of nowhere. I'm sure you've had it. You start an exam at 2 p.m. and come 3 p.m. something kind of isn't going too well in your body, so then in that case that's okay, because that's something that came up after the exam started. In those cases where something does go wrong after the exam starts, the best thing to do is just to stop the exam and email me. Just email me at CS1531. It's pretty much the only time we want you to email me throughout the exam at all, so just in general, if it's not really to stop the exam, I'd rather you, or it's not something really personal or private, I'd rather you post on the forum, which we'll get to as well. Point is, don't sit the exam if you're unwell. Do apply for a SUP. I don't know where the SUPs will be. There's always, it's a big course, there's always going to be people that don't sit the final exam on the date. But the SUPs for this course are, I can't remember if they're mid-December or early January, but I think they're usually early January. That shouldn't come into your decision making, but obviously that's just a heads up, because who in God's name wants to have an exam, even if it's online, in early January? Not that I think it's too bad, because I do think 1531 is relatively easy, all things considered. Remember to apply for special consideration. I can't grant you a SUP, right? If you are sick and you can't do the exam, I'm not the person who's here's a new exam. That kind of happens centrally, and it all gets slowly fed down to me, and I just get given a list of who has to sit the next exam. In terms of the date, time, and duration of the exam, it is a 3-hour exam. It begins at 2 p.m., ends at 5 p.m. It's an afternoon exam. Who's thrilled about that? Does anyone hate morning exams? Does anyone hate morning exams if they're like in person? You have to get to UNSW at 8 o'clock? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Well,
have 2 exams on that day.
you have 2 exams on that day.
What subject?
Well,
Everyone in general.
Well, what's your other exam on that day?
it's an elect subject morning.
So you have an elect subject in the morning.
11:11? Or
I don't know about the time. I think it's
oh no,
9.
like what kind is it?
Oh no, it's like 3 1.
Oh no.
Right, 2 exams suck. At least you get a lunch break, I guess. Yeah, so it's 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Obviously, everyone here probably lives in Sydney. I assume most of you here don't live in like, Vietnam or something. But if you are kind of based in Indo-Asia or other parts of the world, generally afternoon exams are useful because you just kind of sit them at the same time as everyone else. I think that's also true for people in the US mostly. But there are some people that may be in absolutely horrible time zones, and if that's you for some reason, I think like a bad time might be if you're in London or something. Let me know. If anyone in here or online or whatever has any ELSs in equitable learning, what do you call it? Like considerations where you get extra time because of some kind of impairment or consideration. I've already been told about that, and I kind of communicate that to students before the exam. So some students get extra time during the exam, because maybe they have trouble writing or that kind of realm of things. That's all being taken care of, and that's dealt with centrally. So if you're one of those people, don't stress too much about it. Let me check the chat really quick. Actually, let me just look up the YouTube for it. It's probably easier. No. Great, no questions. So in terms of the exam structure, the exam's worth 100 marks. That doesn't really mean anything. Marks are just numbers, right? But the important thing is that it's 30% of the course. It's a nice and low number. It used to be a little lower, but we jacked it up a little bit because we got kind of complaints from students that the project mark was too high last term, so we kind of tweaked it a little bit to play around with it. But overall, it's a fairly small amount, and there's going to be like a substantive number of people who've done pretty well in the course, and I like exams where you can go into the exam knowing that you've probably passed the course already, or if you haven't passed the course, that you shouldn't be too far off passing the course. A good example is, let's say you got, what are the labs worth? They worth 15%? Sorry, I changed it every 10, so the project 60 still? Yeah, cool. So labs, let's say you got 8 out of 10 for the labs, and then for the project you got like 70 out of 100, which might equate to like 50 out of 70 or something. Well, actually, you've already passed easily. You got like 58 out of 80. I didn't say that right. It's not 50 out of 70. It's like 42 out of 60. It's like, or something like that. It's if you probably already passed if you've gotten like good in the labs and like pretty okay in the project. And if you didn't do great in the project and you got like 50% for iterations 1, 2, and 3 on average, which isn't like you've probably all got higher than 50% average, right, for iteration 1, 2, and 3. Then that's 30 plus your labs, which is like 38. So now you're going into the final exam only needing to get like a scaled mark of 12 out of 30, So for most of you, the vast majority of you, probably not you all here because you're probably quite engaged, the exam shouldn't be something that dictates whether you pass or fail the course. It should be something that dictates like whether you do like okay or really good, So hopefully that's the case for all of you. But the exam itself is broken up into 15 marks that are short answer. It's about 15 marks. Like usually we say like 15 to 20 marks. It's something in that realm. That's where we ask you simple questions like, what is the difference between the design and the development part of the software engineering lifecycle? And they're usually like worth 1, 2, or 3 marks. And the purpose of these questions is purely to make sure that we can test some of the softer topics and skills that we teach in the course. As opposed to just programming. Programming is really easy to auto-mark and it's super fair, right? It's a little better than short answer. Short answer can sometimes reward people for how well they can communicate in English, which can be a little bit difficult. It can also, be really hard to mark fairly. Usually we get one tutor to mark one whole question. We don't really like get your tutors to mark all of your classes and stuff. So like don't feel like little interpretations would be unfair because one person will mark like literally just like 700 of one question. But we don't do a lot of it because it's a pain to mark. And it takes up like more than half the marking budget just in that. But most of the marks are programming questions. They are similar to tutorial and lab questions. They're typically quite small. Some of these questions might be HTTP based. So if you think about like some of your earlier labs where we just ask you to, write some code that checks like a password, check whether the password's secure or something like that. They might be easier questions, and the harder questions might be the building a little mini web server. But typically we have like 5 to 8 little programming questions in the final exam. In most of the questions, we do ask you to write some basic tests, and we tell you that we will mark you off if your test pass your code, whatever. Your test pass your code, and then the coverage and everything else. We don't, however, do as it says here. I think it's here. Maybe it's further down, but we don't do any style marking in the final exam, and we don't do any linting either, right? The general principle here is that I think that timed programming is kind of a useful thing to assess a little bit. I don't think it should be like more than a quarter of the course. I don't particularly like closed book programming. That was the econ. Sorry. Should work. I don't like closed book programming where like people can't look up on the internet, because I don't think that's indicative of the real world, right? All of you get that? Yeah. But I don't mind kind of time pressure exams, because like the reality is that actually like, for most of you at some, like in your careers or lives after, you're actually probably going to do a whole bunch of programming. Not the majority of it, but a small amount of it that like, sometimes you just need to do the thing. Sometimes it needs to get done that day, or it needs to get done that 2 days, or you need to wrap up, So there's a little bit of like that pressure that I think is semi-useful to assess, as long as it's a small part of the course. But yeah, we don't do any linting or style for that reason, because it's a little bit unfair, because again, in the real world, if someone's like, get this done today, they don't actually expect you to do a great job of it. They're kind of just like, yeah, we just got to get it done. There's no hurdle for the final exam if that wasn't kind of implied already by my comments. So that means that you can actually, like if you've already gotten, we had a student do this, I think like last term or something. If you've already like passed the course, like let's say you've gotten like 70% in the project and you've gotten 10 out of 10 for the labs, you can just like not turn up for the final exam and just get 0 and like pass the course and like move on with your life. I think we did have one student that did that last term. I think I emailed them and I was like, hey, you didn't submit anything. And they're like, yeah, I already passed. And I was like, oh, yeah, exactly. I was like, okay, have a great day, sir.
I feel like if they're already like competent enough to like pass the course without the exam, I feel like may as well just sit it and get a good mark.
Yeah, I mean, you could sit it and get like, you could sit it and just get a third of it like that, Yeah, the exam's not too bad. I think something to flag about the exam too is that it's kind of designed to be, I just said the exam's easy, but it's kind of designed to be hard in the sense of, not that the questions are hard, but we give you like a fair volume of things to do, right? It's not like a massive amount, but the idea is that we don't want most students finishing the whole exam, because the questions are actually like easy enough. Like we don't ask you these like super complicated questions, because if you're under time pressure, I don't really like the idea of asking, how lab questions are actually like really complicated sometimes. Like it's like a lot of reading and you got to like, they're much simpler than the lab questions, the exam questions. And that's good, because I don't want to give anyone an anxiety attack. And I also don't like asking like too hard questions, because then you're like, if I can't figure one of them out, I feel like I just like effed my whole exam, right? So that's why we give you like these little bite-sized questions, and they're like pretty manageable overall. But we need to make them hard enough that we can pin you for plagiarism. Every term people cheat. This is going to be my blanket comment again. This is like such an easy exam to find cheaters in, because like we just take your code. I'm not talking to any of you specifically. We just like we compare all of your code to each other. And people share code. It happens every term. Someone just emails it to their friend. And most of the plagiarism, so how plagiarism detection software works, it's really simple. It breaks your code down to a series of symbols. So let's say that you have, what would you call it? Like a statement, like if A like this, or and then if B, and then int I equals 4, and this is like C like. I don't know why I'm writing C right now, but I am, what it'll actually do is it'll actually, and then someone else comes along and writes similar code, and they call this one int A and like int B, like this, and then they maybe swap these around, and they go and change their code, change this to like Z and Y. Plagiarism detectors, basically what they do is they just take your code and they kind of ignore white space, they kind of ignore what you call things, they kind of ignore the ordering of stuff, because obviously, the ordering here makes a bit of, I meant to use functions, not if statements, and it just like turns it into a little symbol tree, and then it just compares the symbol trees, and pretty much the symbol trees look really similar. Point is, if you take someone's code and you try and like reverse engineer it, like strip a few things out, add a few things, rearrange some stuff, change the variable names, you'll pretty much always get caught. And then the problem is, if you're actually smart enough and you have the time to like really rip their stuff apart in for the simple questions and like really go and change a ton of it and like come up with a whole, you could have solved the problem. You know what I mean? There's like a non-overlap on the Venn diagram between people who have enough competency to actually go and like change it substantially and who could just like not do it themselves. You know what I mean? It's like, if you're smart enough, you don't need to cheat, kind of thing. So, yep.
Like the smaller questions, isn't it likely that two random people would have similar code?
It's a good point. So that's why I don't make the questions too easy. Because ideally, I'd ask you like 50 questions that are all like super snappy, like multiple choice, because that gives you the highest chance of being able to express yourself. Because the problem with programming questions is it can be really like, you either get it or you don't sometimes, right? Like, that's the problem with programming in general. Sometimes I have students email me and be like, oh, like 70% works. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't work. Like you don't want a building to like stay up 70% of the time. It's like it like works or it doesn't. So therefore, most students actually tend to get like 80 to 100% on a question or 0. So I like to give as many questions as we can, but we give a few fewer so that we can make them harder, so that when we do match for plagiarism, we have a higher degree of like, this just isn't a coincidence. Also, gosh, if you have freaking friends from high school you came to uni with, stop cheating with like the friend that has the ZID that's like 1 less than you. Like we know you registered for UNSW at the same time. We like know you know each other. Like 2 people like have like the same work, and then their ZIDs are like 536 4111, and then one's like 4112. And they're like, I've never spoken to this person before. It's like, you have. So, yeah.
Do you ever just like judge the people that plagiarize as well, and like you didn't even put in any effort, or like you look at others and you're like, you put in quite a bit of effort, or like something like that?
People who like put in a lot of effort to cheat?
Yeah.
Not often. There's probably an argument to say that if they did, maybe we didn't catch them, potentially. Like maybe there are just like a lot of smart people out there. But the people, they're much dumber than you'd expect, honestly. Like, some people like copy people's code and forget to like remove comments that say like, who wrote it.
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, like they'll be like, author Hayden. And it's like, from Jess. It's like, did you write that, Jess? So, yeah, lots of things. We actually do have other ways that we kind of can suss it out, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can we get like partial marks for if I get like 80% of the code right but 20% wrong or non-complete? Do we get partial marks like in the labs?
Oh, that's a good question. So the exam's really hard because we asked like 8 questions and there's like 600 of you. So suddenly we're dealing with like 2,400 different questions. And then therefore and then if someone's like, can you go look at my code? It's like, well, we kind of have to go look at everyone's code. It becomes like a bit of like an actual just organizational nightmare. Which is also why we ask lots of questions, so that if you kind of screw up a question because of a small mistake, it's like, well, you lost the marks for it probably. Like if your code just has a logic error in it that could be fixed with 1 line, it's like, well, you didn't put the line in, so you lost that mark. You lost that, 6% of 30%, so you lost like, just that small slither. So basically we don't generally look at your code. What we do though, is me and tutors that we pay, we go and find all the students who got 0 or really close to 0 in the exam, particularly the programming mark part. And we look for people who got 0 or who just failed the course. As in they might have done well in the exam, but they like failed the course at like 48 or 49. And those people we go back and we manually look at their stuff kind of very quickly. Because what we want to make sure like in the 0 of the exam cases that someone didn't fail because they were working on a Windows computer that inserted a whole bunch of hidden symbols into the text file, which caused the JavaScript interpreter to like crap its pants, you know, like on a true technicality. Because if someone gets 0 in the exam, it's kind of like, that's weird. You know, most students who sit the exam don't get 0. They usually attempt a question. Sometimes they put files in the wrong folder, or they rename all the files for like God knows what fucking reason. You know, like you like call it question 1 and they rename it to like apple banana, and you're like. So we'll look at that, because obviously we don't want someone like losing 30% of the course just because they rename files like an idiot. And we don't like people failing because like, let's say there was a 1-line logic error in one of your files that caused you to get 0 instead of 6. If you don't get an HD by a mark for that, that's just life, you know, to an extent, and we can only do so much. But if you fail the course, that kind of has a flow-on effect of your life. So if you are a student who's like worried about failing, rest assured we do invest the time to make sure no one fails on a technicality.
Like how is it possible to like get 0.7 out of 1 in a lab, because that's what happened?
The exam we typically have 5 or 6 tests for a question, and then we run coverage on it too. So it's kind of just how many tests they pass and like what the coverage is, kind of thing. That's why usually students tend to get like 4 out of 6 for a question, 5 out of 6, 6 out of 6, or 0. Because like, you know what it's like. Once you pass a test, you tend to pass like.
So there is kind of like a partial marking. Like,
yeah.
Well, my question was like, is it like either 6 out of 6 or 0 out of 6?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess what I answered was still relevant separately, but yeah, no, there are partial marks, but yeah, typically there are people just pass a lot or not many. Okay, so the exam's on GitLab. You'll kind of get a sense of how the exam runs by just looking at the sample exam that we provide you with, that's at the bottom. But what we would ask that you do is make sure that your code works on, make sure it works on VLab in particular. Because who codes on their own computer here? Does anyone avoid VLab altogether? Yeah? Cool. So like if you have the right version of Node.js, the one we use, it's probably just going to work. On like if your local machine uses that version and VLab uses that version, like you're fine. I'd still check it, but make sure you probably check your code on the UNSW system. That's like a formal thing I have to put here as like a bit of a disclaimer, but like in reality, you know, in like a friend-to-friend kind of way, again, if you're using the right Node version and you're strapped on time, you'll probably be fine. You know, I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. It's something I might do like, I maybe, you know, if you know you have the same Node version, which is the main thing, and you can find out your Node version anytime just by writing, you know, Node version. You know, there's your Node version. Then maybe I just check it after the exam, because there'll be like 1 out of 1,000 of you will have done something terribly wrong. And if you email me like 15 minutes after the exam finishes and you're like, I just discovered that my Node version is wrong, I'll probably take a lot of sympathy for you. Because you were clearly engaged, you know. I only get annoyed when someone emails me like 2 weeks later. Also, I'll tell you a story. It's like one of my favorite stories. I had a student once, like, finished the exam at like 5 o'clock, and then they emailed me at like 5:01, and they were like, I can't push to Git. I have an error. And I'm like, yeah, there's a typo in your command line. And then they emailed me at like 11:30 p.m. that night. And they were like, oh, whoops. Can I push now? I was like, no, you can't push now. The exam finished when the sun was up, you know? And I asked them, I was like, I couldn't even think about that. I was just like, where'd you go? You know, like, what did you get up to for 8 hours when you couldn't push your exam, right? Like, if you couldn't push your exam, you'd be shitting the bed, wouldn't you? You'd be like pacing your room, calling your friend, like stressing out. And he was just like, I got really worried, so I had a nap. I was like, damn. Anyway, don't take a stress nap when you need to sort something in your life out.
Just pushing one like question or
Everything.
everything?
Oh,
So
wow.
Did they fail? Don't leave us on a cliffhanger.
I don't remember. There's so many like random obscure student things I deal with, but they definitely either had to sit a sup or they got a penalty, but I don't remember. But don't push right at the end. You know, it's so easy to push, right? You all know your kit. It's like push 10 minutes in. It's not like you're like, oh, it's not finished yet. It's like, well, then you're gonna finish it, right? You know, and you'll just push again later. Not really, because like it'll just de-stress you. You know, like if you push 10 minutes before the end of the exam, like keep working and then push at the end of the exam. But if something really bad happens, and you're not sure if your push will be accepted or something, it's just less stress on your brain, rather than like I push nothing, and then like your computer blows up, and like you email me, and then I take a stress nap, and then I reply at midnight. You know, like you don't want to have that emotional burden of like such a big risk. Make sure you're comfortable with an API client like ARC or Postman, because the final exam will probably definitely have some kind of HTTP request test in there somewhere. So definitely do that. And technical issues relating to your local environment and not grounds for special consideration. This is a bit complicated, because what this means is that if your computer catches on fire, right, that's grounds for special consideration, naturally, because your computer caught on fire. If you're like, you know, my terminal's frozen and it's not loading on like your local computer, the response you're going to get is use VLab then, you know. So go into the exam either like very comfortable that you're very comfortable with your computer, or just be ready to use VLab in some kind of mid case, not like a worst case, but like a mid-level case. Because again, if you're like, I run my code but my terminal's frozen, it's just like we're just going to say use VLab, because we know VLab works, you know, because it's like centrally managed, and we can debug things a bit easier there. So again, that's a bit disclaimery. On the topic of special consideration, I'm not sick, by the way. I'm like post-sick. I was like sick 2 weeks ago, if you remember. I haven't like put that. You know that annoying cough you get after you're sick, where you just like kind of cough a little bit, like your throat's dry. Maybe I'm just weird.
COVID?
Yeah, it was COVID. I'll tell you all now. It's a very, very miserable week. So, did anyone go to that networking event CSE Soc ran? Yeah, some little crap of a person gave it to me there, I think. I'm going to find them. On the topic of special consideration, I had a point to make about... No, I don't know. It'll come back to me. Okay, so during the exam, it's an open book exam. That means you can use the internet, which is great, but you can't talk to other people. So, you know, Google anything you want, but you're not allowed to, you know, go on Facebook or anything like that. And then you think, well, how are you going to know if I'm going to go on Facebook? You know, you're not at my house, Hayden. You're not going to see if I pull my phone out and, you know, I message Barney. I'm like, hey, Barney, what's the answer? The only answer, like, generally people who kind of chat, we pick up on them with, like, plagiarism, because most people who chat share code. And then you'd be amazed how many people who chat tell people things as well. And then people tell people things who somehow tell me, I don't know why or how, but it's how the world seems to work. So we get lots of instances of people being like, oh, here's a screenshot of something. Has anyone ever been just like ruined by their friend? You ever like told your friend something and then like you had like a 2-degree thing where someone's like sent a screenshot of your chat? If you haven't, this might be the first time during the exam. So be careful of your friends. But it doesn't matter because you're not going to talk to them, right? So don't talk to people during the exam. Frankly, you're probably not going to have time to talk to people during the exam, right? Like who's like getting their phone out and being like, whoa, how hard's question 6? You know, you're going to be like doing the exam. Similarly, when the exam finishes, you know, I'm just trying to see if I've written this here explicitly. I don't think I wrote it explicitly, but When the exam finishes, you're kind of prohibited from talking about the exam for the rest of the evening. When I say kind of, I mean like you are prohibited from it with other people. And I'll give you an example of why you should be really careful. So we had a student who finished the exam, then they talked to their friend, and then they sent the answers to their friend, like, this is what I did, and turns out their friend had extra time that they didn't know about. So their friend took their work and uploaded that, because their friend was like, oh, great, answers. I didn't finish it. I struggle with it. Then they both got hit for plagiarism. They both got 0 for the exam, So point is that you don't, and these were people who knew each other well, right? So the exam kind of runs until 9 p.m. that night. We got lots of people with extra time and people that start late, a whole bunch of stuff. I'm kind of just around my desk all evening. So just assume that generally, don't go posting on Discord or all these other things. Obviously you're still going to message your friends, call up your friends and be like, oh, God, that exam was so crap. Hayden's such a dickhead. Hate him so much. I'm just going to punch him in the face next time I see him. Gossip all you want, but don't, just avoid being like, let me send you code or something like that, because you might shoot yourself in the foot, get in trouble, etc. If you do need help during the exam, we want you to post on the forum. So what we do during the exam is we make all questions on the forum private by default, so you can't post a public question, and then tutors answer them. So we have tutors who help out on the forum during the exam. Lost my page. Don't message tutors on Teams. Don't email tutors. Don't email me. I won't check my inbox because my inbox gets destroyed by emails all the time. I will check my inbox for people who, are like, a car just crashed into my house. I can't finish the exam. Crazy stuff happens, by the way. But if you email me a question, it's like, hey, I'm really confused about question 3. I'm just going to either I don't pretend I'll delete it. That's for dramatic effect. I won't delete your email. I don't believe in not replying to emails, but I will reply and just ask you to post it on the forum. And you will have lost that 10 minutes. It'll take me 15 minutes to find your email, and then I'll reply, and then you'll see it 10 minutes later, and then no one's going to start looking at your question. You know what I mean? So don't email me questions, because I look at the forum too, and I work with tutors on the forum. I remember the point about special consideration. One of the most common things that we have happen during the final exam is internet issues. Now, what I'd say is if you have generally semi-unstable internet, maybe has anyone got a room at that end of their house where Wi-Fi is just like a little shit? Yeah, So it's like, if you're like that, obviously you're smart enough to go to another room if it's bad, right? But if something's kind of semi-bad and it's knowably bad, go somewhere else. Go to another part of the house, go to your family or friends, go to a library or something. That one's easy to mitigate and is generally not grounds for special consideration, but one that is kind of grounds is if something horrible happens, like say your internet just cuts off for some reason, and you're like, I don't know, and then your parents come into the room, they're like, did you screw up with the internet? And you're like, no, I didn't. And they're like, you're that nerd, you probably did. And you're like, I didn't. And then everyone's confused. In that case, it's important that you reach out to your internet service provider, Telstra, Optus, whoever you get internet with, or you get your parents too if you're scared of doing it. And you basically just get, or whoever's something official, get something that clearly states that there was an outage. Most companies will do it. You're like, I have an outage, can you confirm there's an outage? And we're like, yeah, we can confirm we're having issues in your area between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. today. Yeah.
Public service announcement. So basically, if you search up Wi-Fi outages in Google, there's an NBN thing.
The NBN outages?
Where you could type in your address and then it will tell you if there's an outage happening or not right now.
Yeah, definitely. So you can skip the emailing part if it's just an NBN blanket issue because they're probably listing it somewhere. Or that's not for me, that's for special consideration. Because typically what happens is if you just apply for special consideration and you're like, my internet's out, and you don't give any evidence, they'll email me and they'll be like, Barney said that their internet's out. Was it? And I'll be like, I don't know. And they'll probably just reject it. Whereas if you like attach like a screenshot or an email or something that's like, or you know whatever, they'll be like, oh, that seems legitimate, and they'll like give you a pass for that. Usually they will still check with me. They'll be like, you know, this person said that they got interrupted an hour into their exam. Is that true? You know, we'll go through the GitLab logs and figure that out. When you post questions on the forum, please post good questions. The way tutors do the forum is they don't like, every time you post a question and every time you post a comment, we get like a little notification and we just kind of go through that in order. So if you like post a question and it's like a bad question that we don't know what you're talking about, and we have to provide you with a follow-up 10 minutes later that's like, can you explain more? And then you reply 2 seconds later, takes like say another 10 minutes to get an answer. So sometimes if you just take that extra like 60 seconds to like explain yourself, don't rush panic a question. Obviously you're going to be fast and cut some corners, but people ask tons of stupid questions during the exam, like, I don't understand what question 6 means. Is it referring to, you know, roads or bridges? And we're like, what? Like what are you talking about? You know? And then they go and ask like a better question. We're like, oh, there's the answer. So don't shoot yourself in the foot with that. Were there questions here? Yeah, there were. How are ZIDs created? I don't know how ZIDs are created. I know that previously, I mean, you know, I started uni like 10 years ago, so it's all a blur, but I mean, I don't know what it was like for you. I remember after like the UAC acceptance thing came in, you just go to like a UNSW website and you enter some details and you click the button and then you get an account or something. So I think ZIDs just used to be generated based on like the order that happened in. So your ZID is like chronological based on when you like became a UNSW family member, you know. How do you differentiate from genuine coincidence? So this is a step back, and actual cheating. Okay, how do we differentiate between genuine coincidence and actual cheating? It's an art form, is what I'll tell you. There are lots of people in the school who've done it for a long time. I've been doing it for 4 years. People have been doing it for like 12 years. Again, I don't want to say too much, but you can tell there are certain things that students do when they cheat that make it really obvious, but we have to have confidence that they cheated to say that they cheated. You know, if this makes sense. You know when has anyone just had people lie to you and you just know they're lying, no matter how much BS they give you? It's kind of like that. Sometimes students like are just like, I didn't cheat. And you just look at the amount of similar code and you're like, I'm sorry, that's just not possible. You know, but these aren't like this shouldn't have anyone sitting around being like, what if it's just a genuine mistake? Genuine mistakes happen all the time. There are often times we think students cheat and we email them and then they reply and we chat to them and we look at their code and we think, yeah, maybe they might have cheated, but we're not sure enough, you know? So it's not like we're just like, ping, done, shot dead. If there's a pretty reasonable excuse, but you know, most of the people who clearly cheat and deny it, and also like often when people cheat, there's like cheating chains. It's incredible. Like 2 people share code and then that person shares code with another person. They share it with 2 people. So there's like a big like matrix of like 12 people who have like very similar code. And then one person will tell you the freaking truth. They'll be like, I'm sorry, I cheated. And then like you're like, oh, great. And then you like know the other person cheated. And then they're like, okay, you got me. And then you know the other person. Yeah, it's like a domino effect. So, but the point is that I sincerely believe like people who don't cheat don't get punished. That's it. And people who cheat get punished a lot, but probably not all the time. That's probably what I'd leave with that. Using VS Code SSH should still work properly. Yep, tons of people do that. Night cakes, will the exam window change if enough of my experience stuff gets changed? Yeah, so obviously we have our like my experience table thing. This is a little less generous than last term. Last term I think said everything over 45%, but we got a bit too much extra time. It was like 23 minutes, which I know you're like, that all. You know, I want 50 minutes. But it was a little too much because actually, I'm just going to completely debunk myself here because suddenly the problem was then people had afternoon exams, but this is an afternoon exam, so none of that makes sense. I'll see if I'm feeling generous and we might lower the threshold. Yeah.
What percentage do we have now?
I don't know. Let's check.
I guess like maybe 25%.
35-ish.
How many people have filled in my experience?
Yeah, every time we go to the middle, it pops up.
Yeah, and that's
Oh.
the reason why I did it.
Oh, it shows you the courses percentage?
No, it shows you
32.
Like, you have a pending.
This is incredible. I would only get to 32 after like 3 emails. And you're just like, free stuff. And everyone's like, fill out the survey.
Yeah, everyone's on Discord like asking other people too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're like,
So are you feeling a bit more generous now?
no, I'll wait till it's over to decide. Because, you know, if we only get like 55%, I'm going to be like, you guys didn't try. Last term they did like 70-ish. It's like 69, you know? So if you guys can get to, you know, something around that, then probably. But I'm not going to reward you for being worse than last term, is the point. You're not going to get like 53 and I'm going to be like, oh, you deserve X. No. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I only just realized how stupid it was because I forgot this was an afternoon exam because I changed it for the morning exam problem. So to be continued, that one. Okay. Submission. It's same as the project and stuff. Except there's no submit command. We just take what's on the master branch. So come the end of the exam, we basically just like take what's on your master branch and that's your submission. So as long as your code's on master, on GitLab, which you should all know how to do because of all your labs and all your project, that's all there is to it. Here's some useful troubleshooting information here. Nothing really to be said about that. And in terms of preparation, your tutorials and lab questions are very useful to help prepare. One thing I'd say is that you've done them. Like you've done your tutorial and lab questions. So I think one thing I noticed with some students is that, and maybe this is like a carryover from high school for some people, is they're used to kind of doing the assessments and then like starting to prepare for the exam as like a separate topic. Like, okay, let's get all my material together and start like studying for the exam. But you know, the beauty of computing subjects is like you've been studying all term. Because the final exam is just like your labs and your project. It's like the same stuff. The benefit for us is that we probably just get to test you in a slightly more reliable way. Because labs, a bunch of you guys cheat, not you specifically. Again, we know people cheat on the labs. That's why they're not worth a lot. You know, it's too hard to police. It's too hard to write them again every term. You know, and the project is obviously a group work thing. So I'm sure somewhere out there, Barney's paying someone to give a good. To make the commits for her, you know. Exactly. So that probably happens. So the exam's a chance to kind of just help weed that stuff out a bit. So you have been practicing for the exam by doing the tutes and labs. There are also the practice questions, which I think all of you have been ignoring, and that's totally fine. You can just follow that link. These are labs from previous terms. So when we rewrote all the labs in 22T2, we got all the labs from before 22T2 and just like converted them to JavaScript from Python, and we like lumped them all together into a big repo with solutions. So if you've done all the labs in the course and you're like, I still feel a little bit dumb, then you can go and do the practice activities. They're just like mini labs.
Are they like similar to the current labs in the sense that if you did well, then there's no point really going and checking them?
Yeah, I'd probably say, yeah, I think so. Like, the exam's not like an intellectual beast, you know. Like if you did the labs and you did the project, you can do the exam today. You know, they're probably useful for people who maybe feel like they finished the labs a while ago and they finished the project in week 10 and the exam's coming up in 2 days and they're like, I feel a bit out of practice and I've already done the sample exam or something like that. Probably one of the benefits of the practice questions is that they're Like if the lab difficulty's up here, and the practice question difficulty's down here, the exam questions are probably like somewhere here. Because previously in the course, a year ago, we used to have, there was like 6 lab questions a week, but they're all really easy. And I got Tam. Who knows Tam? Has anyone seen Tam on the forum? Tam the man. He helped rewrite all the labs, and one of the mandates we had with him was like, let's stop doing these like 6 little labs where no one really feels like they learn a lot. Let's actually just do less labs and make them like meatier. So they're a bit like more challenging, but people actually walk away with like a more genuine understanding, so that we could bridge that gap between like really easy labs and like a really hard project. That was a common problem students had, was they did the labs and they were like, this is great, but I feel like then the project's still like really scary up here because it's a big complex system. But a sample exam exists. Open. Yay, I'm logged into GitLab. The final exam will be very similar to this. So go do the sample exam. We should have solutions somewhere. I don't have them here. I'll probably go sort that out later on. We'll kind of...
Are they past papers?
We only have one at the moment, and a big part of that's because we changed the course a bit. So we'll probably put like last term's exam up like next year as a past paper, but for the moment, like one of the plus sides about you guys is you actually have this really fresh course that's much better than the previous ones, but the downside is that we don't really have like a bunch of past papers. But that doesn't really matter too much because again, past papers we could just, like one term, you know, students were like, oh, what are past papers? And I just like mashed together some lab questions and was like, there's a past paper. And they're like, thank you. And it's like, they're just questions. So the point of the sample exam is to give you a sense of scope, is how, you know, yeah.
Lab questions, we had certain functions written previously. So will that be written in the final exam as well? Like you could, the functions that are given, you need to put in the code in that function, something like that.
Oh, maybe, yeah. Anything similar to the labs could happen. We might give you code.
Or is it, do we have to completely write the code by ourselves?
Bit of both. Like, I mean, we're not going to ask you to do like, 45 minutes of coding or anything. But sometimes we might give you some code. Sometimes we might ask you to write it from scratch. But if we like ask you to write it from scratch, it's probably 10 minutes of work. And if we give you code, it's probably 10 minutes of work. And if we didn't give you the code, it would probably be 20, like it's all just about, we have a certain amount of work we think we want you to do. And if we think that's like way too hard, we'll give you some starter stuff so that it doesn't like totally destroy your time. But the labs and tutorials and practice questions are really all about actually you getting comfortable with the theory and the content, The sample exam, why this is here is to give you a sense of the scope of the exams, to give you a sense of like, if you sat down and did it, you'd be like, I have a feeling of how hard this is, how long this takes, how it's structured, what I'm generally being asked about. So it exists here not as practice so much, but as to get familiar with the environment. It's also really good because you can go and clone it. Like I would encourage you, go clone the sample exam, go work on it on VLab or locally, go do the stuff, go run coverage. Like you can literally do a dry run of the whole thing because the final exam will literally just be another repo like this, except the questions will be different. Everything else will be the same. So it's a really easy exam to prepare for. There is a personal repo that we link for you. That's wrong, but the personal exam repo, the way the final exam works is that we have one repo that isn't deployed to your list of repos. That's the spec, which is this. It's just a README file, but all of you get deployed a small repository, which I will find. Oh, no, I'll just look at last terms. I must have had a problem deploying. But it basically looks like this, where... Hello.
We got lost for an hour.
Oh, that's fun. It's all right, we're nearly done, so... Do you guys find the forum post eventually?
Pardon?
Did you find the forum post? I assume so.
We didn't check the forums.
How'd you get here then?
We went to a live stream and we saw the first 20 seconds you said, "Oh, we moved." So
You're like,
yeah,
oh
we
shit.
came off though.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Hello. What journey have you all been on? Cool.
Oh, you should have written on the blackboard.
That would have been a genius idea. Thank you. Damn it. You're all so smart. The point is, for the final exam, the repo you actually do your work in is like a separate repo, and it has like all the questions and the stub code in there. The spec's in another repo. The reason we do this is actually really simple. It's because if we put the spec in this repo, which we could do, we could like send you all out a copy of this repo each, like your labs and project and stuff. But if the spec's in the repo, then it's really hard to do updates because we have to like roll them out, which takes 20 minutes, and then it comes up as a merge request, and we're not going to get you. If we have a clarification in the final exam, we're not going to like go through like a 20-minute merge request lifecycle, right? We just update the exam spec repo so that during the exam you can just like literally, we just email you and say we've clarified something, we've updated the spec, go refresh the page. So this page, the exam spec, is just a GitLab page. You don't clone it, you don't do anything with it, it doesn't come into your repo, whereas all of you get a copy of the actual like exam or exam sample repo. This is where you do your actual work. That's just how we've structured that. Yeah, that's about it. That's good. Do you have any questions about the exam?
Is there any like requirements in terms of TypeScript? Or, like what's the expectation for that? Is it TypeScript, JavaScript?
That's a good question. I will double check. We've only done one JavaScript TypeScript exam before, so I can't remember right off the top of my head, but my memory of it was that we asked a kind of mix of questions. But the TypeScript questions were not like TypeScripty. Like they weren't like, no one would get stuck because they feel TypeScript scary.
Do you have to like do the TypeScript compiler checks and all that, or is it just like?
No, none of that. Yeah.
Can we change the package.json and do new packages?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But then, can we change the package scripts?
Yeah. Yeah.
So are we gonna like insert our own package.json, or are they gonna be like automatically ready?
Oh, it'll all be ready. Yeah. Like it's a very programming exam. Like if we go look at the sample exam for a second, it's very like take question 7. Answer the question timetable.ts, complete the function timetable. We're given a list of dates and list of hours and minutes. It generates and returns a list of date times. Okay. Now this question is a little silly because it was a Python question that we converted. So a real exam question will probably be less confusing. But we give you something like that. So there's your function, and you just kind of go fill in the function. You like unstub it. Most of the programming exams just quite that, like 5 or 6 times. And the answers won't be complex. They'll be like, 5 to 20 lines of code. And it's all like you can add stuff to the package.json and everything. But honestly, the exam questions are usually so simple, you probably won't even need to install anything.
So like jest coverage, everything will be installed.
Yeah, it should already be there. Like we've already got our like jest.config and in the package.json we have all our stuff here. So it's like all set up for you. It's very much a like write code to solve a problem, write jest to test your code.
So we need to write the tests for the codes.
Yeah. If you don't write, let's just double check what it says. If we have a look here, so read this, it says, you receive 50% of your marks from the correctness of your implementation. Basically, we just auto mark your work. 25% from your ability for your test to identify correct and incorrect implementations. So typically what we do then is we actually run your jest against working code that we have, and we expect you to pass it all. And then we run your jest against broken code we have and we expect it to fail at all. It's just like test if your jest is crap or not. And then 25% of your marks from code coverage, as in how well does your test coverage your code. Now, it's a little bit of a catch-22 thing here, because obviously you could write one jest test and you'd probably get pretty good for like this part. Because if you've got one test, it's probably going to work, right? Like your one test will pick up on good code and pick up on bad code, but your coverage will probably suck because, if you've only written one test, it's very unlikely that test, like one simple test, it's very unlikely that test would actually have good coverage on your code. So there's a little bit of like...
Can't you have like different specs in the same test that cover everything? Instead of breaking it into different tests?
You can. I mean, obviously you could do that if you want. But I'd probably recommend breaking it up a bit. Mainly just because, I guess when I said one test, I probably meant more like a simple test. Like, because you could have, like, here's a good example, which is not a good example, but let's say you just had a test. Like, some of the marks are guaranteed. Like, say there's 25% of your ability to identify correct and incorrect implementations. If you just have one jest test that was like, expect true to be true, then you're going to correctly identify all the correct implementations that your tests run against. So that's like 12.5% of each question if you just write that. Pro tip, yeah. But you'll get like 0 for coverage, and you'll get like 0 for the other part of that.
Is the coverage based on your own coverage or the coverage on the tests of like the sample code that you run the tests against?
It's based on your tests. Yeah.
So you can see the values.
Yeah, exactly. So the coverage is probably the only mark you should, in theory, know before. Maybe not the mark exactly, but that's how you should know how you went with that, because your tests will give you some comfort, because that made no sense. Yeah.
In case you don't pass the coverage and pass the implementation and test, will that implementation test marks be given, or because coverage is not working, you won't get those marks?
Say that again.
So if you get if your coverage is not working,
Mm-hmm.
and
What do you mean not working? As in you don't get
like
very
you
good
don't
coverage?
get marks in the coverage.
Sure.
But your implementation and this test is working fine. You get good scores in that. So will those scores be marked, or because coverage is not working, those scores will not be marked as well?
What do you mean by remark? Like
you would get 50% and 25% in your test and implementation even if you don't get scores in coverage.
Yeah, you can get it all. Like they're all separate.
Okay.
Yeah, like they're like we mark you on that, we mark you on that, we mark you on that. We just plus them together. Yeah.
Is the expectation that we will be able to finish the exam, or is it we won't?
It's a good question. It's kind of hard because it depends how kind of ruthless people run through the exam. But I've described it a few different ways. I expect, like an above average student to finish the exam and do okay at it. Some people will finish it and get a whole bunch of questions wrong. Some people will do like 70% of it and get everything they do right. I'd say that just generally for the average person, you should go into the exam knowing that, you're probably going to do, and it's hard to tell because last term we had that extra 25 minutes, which seemed to help everyone finish the exam mostly. You'll probably do 80% of the exam. Like you'll feel like you got 80% of it out, to use that math term. And then probably a third of what you got out, you actually screwed up. It's a bit complicated because your exam marks are going to be much lower than you think because you make more mistakes than you realize a lot of the time. The number of emails I've kind of had with students who are like, this is not possible. I definitely answered all of the questions. My mark of 72 is unacceptable. You just make mistakes. You're rushing. It's 3 hours. You misinterpret something. There's a typo there. There's a logic error there. A few of those things stack up pretty quick. But the thing is, it happens to everyone. You know, like everyone gets a lower mark than they expect. But we do like alignment and scaling on the exam if it's appropriate. It kind of depends on how the other marks in the course go to an extent. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what was the average exam mark from last term? Because I sort of want to know because I got really traumatized by 1521 exam.
When did you do it?
Last term, yeah.
I don't know if I had to guess. Like I could look it up, but I don't know if I have the average. But
Is it higher than like the project average?
no, definitely not. Projects are pretty high actually. Projects are pretty high because like there's a lot of people working on it. You have a lot of time to work on it. You know, there's a lot of fluffy marks. Like you get marks for Git commits and you know GitLab boards and stuff like that. But I'd say as an example, the average mark might have been like 10 out of 30, which we then scale up to like 14 to 16 out of 30. But basically the exam's pretty well designed that we get a good distribution of students. We get like a nice there aren't many who do super well, there aren't many who do super bad. There's like a nice little mantle in the middle of like people who do pretty okay. And then sometimes we shift that entire curve up, right? But usually only if the marks aren't super high in the course. So I think we did shift it last term, but that's because last term students on average did much worse than all of you in the project. They just like kind of struggled a lot more.
Was 50% last term.
The scaled average?
Oh,
Is this from a notice I wrote or something?
yeah.
Hee.
It says the highest project one was 68.5 out of 70. Looks at a glance like the average mark was around 35 out of 70. So yeah, maybe like.
Yeah, 35 out of 70 for the project.
Yeah.
That's crazy low for the project. Right? Like to get 50% like average mark, that was super low. Last term was crazy. We think it's because it was the first time 1531 ran in T2 last term. So the course was never really designed for people to like do 1511 and then just come straight into 1531. So we think students just hadn't spent enough time programming, so they just really struggled with a lot of stuff. Plus, it was like a bit of a rewrite, so there would have been elements there of like just some hiccups and stuff. There's a few funny things, like I'll give you a really, really random example. Like 3/4 of students did not, that's a bit of just a random number, but about that, like did not start iteration 2 till Monday of week 7. Right? So you think about your iteration 2 that was due on Friday of week 7. Like the majority of students did not start it till like Monday of week 7. Was that any of you? Any of you do that? It's like, no. And that was because they were a bit scared because they're overwhelmed. It's also because I think we could have been clearer on some of the instructions, which scared them a bit about like how to convert to TypeScript. Was the TypeScript conversion pretty chill this time? Yeah, like it was.
I ran TSC the first multi converted. I had like 200 errors or something.
Yeah, like we didn't do great at like it was kind of written there that you don't need to pass TSC, but we didn't probably emphasize it enough. So people that kind of vaguely read specs like freaked out and were like, "Oh, let's worry about this later." But also they didn't watch the week 5 lectures and they didn't do the week 5 labs, if you remember that, like Express Lab, and then they went on Flex Week, and then the lab was due on the Monday of week 7. So the one thing we actually did this term that was different, remember how we forced you guys to do the week 5 lab? That was because we were just like, I hate acting like I was just gonna sit you down and you're gonna do the damn lab and we're gonna force you to learn it so that over the Flex Week when you think about Express, you're not because if you do the lab, you get forced to kind of watch the lecture, which then forces you to get confidence with. Anyway, it's just like a random story about running courses. I don't know how we got onto that. Averages or something. We usually make sure that marks are pretty fair overall, and we generally get a good outcome for most students, so I wouldn't stress about any of it.
Are there any requirements to commit the tests for the code, like with the project? Is that
No. The exam, you could do one commit in the exam. I just probably wouldn't. I don't really care how many commits you do in the exam. I just recommend you push often. I'd commit as often as you push for the final exam. Yeah. Okay, what else we got? Do you get 100% for coverage if you have no code? I don't know. Has anyone ever... Oh, yeah, I mean, yes, I guess.
I guess like you could do an experiment right now.
Yeah, this is what I mean about like the marking for the exam's a little bit funny, because if you look at this, you could in theory write no code, right? Like a function that just returns nothing.
One test,
And you could write one test, and that test would probably give you half of these marks and all of these marks. But you're probably going to like, and I say probably, I don't know how it works. Like, I know a lot of you are now going to be like, hee hee. All the questions I don't do, I'll just like do that. But you like completely screw up these marks. And that's assuming you've like, you know, that you've gotten your assumptions right. Like, who's to say that we don't test 5% of this correct and 20% incorrect?
And stop random if greater than 0.5 is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I always tell people this story. Back when I was doing RoboCup, the robot soccer stuff, you remember hash defines? Yeah. One of the funniest pranks I saw two people play on each other were...
True, false.
It wasn't... Swapping true and false is funny. Right.
So
Right? Like if you know, like hash define true is 1, hash define false is 0, you like swap them around when they're in the toilet and you watch them like brain melt. But the funniest one I ever saw was someone who swapped true to random number between 0 and 1. So every time the code ran true was like, might be false, could be true. That was horrible, but funny. Any other questions?
Do we need to use, like, do we have to use an API client, or can we just like write tests, like HTTP tests?
We don't ask you to do any. Actually, it's a good question. No one's actually ever asked that in the 6 terms I've done this, but we don't ask you to do HTTP tests. So I'll throw you all a bone and be like, you don't have to write HTTP tests in the exam. If you'd like to test your own code, you're welcome to. That's totally fine. So you can like use the API client, you can write your own tests, that's all good. But we won't ever kind of mark your tests. It's just too much. It's just too hard. Like if anyone's ever experienced that with iteration 3 already, to like run the server and then the coverage, it's just a bit of a weird dynamic, and it's just a lot. And then like students will be like, it's not working in the exam. And even like, if you saw my forum post about the leaderboard being delayed, that was because Juliana woke up this morning and was just like, none of it's working. It's like spent 2 hours on it, and I was like, it's like, go to class, stop stressing about your life. So, we don't want to put that on students in the exam either.
So all the HTTP like questions are
Just implementation. Just implementation. It's not hard. We mostly have it in there to weed out people who just like didn't do anything.
but then it's just like harder to verify if your code is working.
Yeah, but it's usually pretty quick to manually test. Sometimes we do actually take people who get really low exam marks and really high project marks, and we're like,
That's because they're like
Maybe they got
teammate
carried.
carried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. So then we'll go, this happens very rarely. Usually we'll go back and look at their stuff and make sure that there's a difference between like, oh, they did okay, they contributed like enough, they weren't the best, and like, Ahmed was perfect, best group member ever, did all the work. It's like, why did he get 0 in the exam then? Someone's getting paid money. Any other questions? We're kind of just killing. Can you please make exam duration longer? I mean, we can make it.
Experience.
Yeah, fill out my experience. We can make it longer, and I can have more questions. I've heard from my tutor that past terms, the final exam was a mini project. I think that's a little bit stupid.
Yeah, I heard that as well.
A mini project.
That's a rumor.
I heard that it had something to do with the project.
Oh, sorry. I thought they meant like the entire exam was a mini project. No, I mean we generally do like the how to put it. I wouldn't call it a mini project. What I'd say is that the HTTP stuff we'll ask you in the exam will feel like a really watered down, simple version of what you already are perfect at if you've done the project. Like you'll see the HTTP questions, and if you actually, who did work in the project for iteration 2 and 3? Me, right? You'll see the HTTP question in the exam and be like, it's easy. Because it's just like, it's like a watered down, simplified version. It's not like a mini project, it's just, I mean, they say mini project, but I mean, you have, you know, 4 or 5 routes, a post, a get, a put. It has some shared memory and a variable. I wouldn't call that a mini project. I just call it like a simple web server. They're just like, you know, and your project is just a complicated web server. So, yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Has the exam been written yet?
It's a good question. Writing it currently.
So you're writing it.
Usually, yes. I mean, I've written most of the exams in general. This term, because they've got me teaching 2 courses, usually I'll work with tutors and I'll be like, come up with some ideas. I'll pick the ideas I like. I'll get them to kind of write it up, and then I'll be like, I don't like that. I don't like this. Let's change that, and I'll go and tweak it. So it's like my exam in the sense of like everything you see I have to take responsibility for. But we do get tutors to kind of help, you know, actually just write the stub code and things like that.
Where will the exam be held? Like, will it be held on Website or GitLab?
Just GitLab, yeah. All online, just GitLab.
Okay.
Did someone have a question?
Also, if I'm working on VLab,
Yep.
would I need to use API client to do the server thing?
You don't have to, but if you wanted to play around with it, you need to do it on. You need to use the API client on VLab, yeah, just like normal. Cool. Going once, going twice. Want to go home?
So
Yeah.
So,
Good. Okay.
story time?
Will there be anything testing front end? No, absolutely not. Okay. No, you don't have to do anything with the front end. That's totally fine. Anyway, that's it for tonight. Thank you to the 15 people who came here. I think there's like 15, literally. And there's 15 people on the live stream. So appreciate it all. Thank you.